that has. So anyway, so then we talked about the gap theory. And the gap theory, again, is Genesis 1:1, everything is created. And then there can be a break of time. And then in Genesis 1:2, you get the making of, shaping of, forming of the world. So that's kind of how that's how the gap theory works. So that's what the gap theory is. The relative beginning theory would say that the first verse is a dependent clause on the second verse. So instead of making creation in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the main clause, it would say it's the second clause, and basically it's saying that God began to create. And so the way so the world was formless and void. And so it starts with this idea that Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 combined with this idea God began to create, and then we see the creation play out over the next few days, the next 6 days. The Anchor Bible, when they talk about it, they say 1:1 is the prologue. So, okay, here's the prologue. God created the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2's got the three clauses, and that's where you begin to see creation. And that part of the creation, again, is this idea that God is shaping creation. So that's how kind of the Anchor Bible explained it. And then the Unger Bible commentary, that 1:1 is the real-time beginning. 1:2 is kind of circumstantial, three clauses again, and the first real day begins on verse 3. So the actual creation, making, forming, everything starts on day 3. That brings us to, so they're all kind of relative in how they start there, is how they kind of get grouped together. So that brings us to historical creationism. And that is, I mentioned the book last week, Genesis Unbound. I know some of y'all have looked for it, looked it up, read reviews on it and stuff. But it's that's the theory presented there. And so understand, Dr. Selhammer, who developed, I think is the one that, Dr. Selhammer will not tell you he's the one that developed the theory. He's telling you he's agreeing with what the Bible wrote all along, and that it's just been misstated how we understand creation. And so that's kind of the. So, but I say he was the one that put it in writing and kind of defends this the most. And so verse 1:1 is God created the heavens and the earth. All right, so that are the land, and he's actually one that talks about the better way to have written that would have been God creates the land and the sky, because that's really, when you see the world, there's land and there's sky. And then later it's going to talk about water, and that's really the three parts of the world, right? There's just three parts of the world. We got water, we got land, we got sky. And the idea of heavens and earth, land and sky, is actually a Hebrew merism. Merism, again, Alpha and Omega. It means that you're everything, all-inclusive. And so that saying that it's land and sky, the reason it doesn't include the water is just like saying Alpha and Omega. It is that God created the land and the sky, so he created everything. Everything was created by God. And then, when we get to verse 2, when we get to this idea, and the key word there, one of the key words, if you look down to number 6, Tobu Wabahu, we talked about that some last week, and I was reading some more about that, getting ready for tonight. And the idea, and this is where, and I mentioned last week, that you had some Greek influence on how we perceive the world, and how the Bible, when it was written, was very shaped by Greek, not Greek mythology, because then that would be the wrong way of saying it. But the view the Greeks had of the world had an impact on how the English was interpreted, how the Septuagint was interpreted, and so that's where. And part of it is with this idea of Tobu Wabahu. So Tohu is this idea. It gives this idea. And we talked about the mud ball last week. That it's just formless and void. There's just nothing there. It just exists. And so that's the way a lot of times people, without saying it exactly that way, it's just this is it, and then God formed it from there. But this idea of where the earth, so verse 2, the earth was formless and void, and so he believes that the best way to say that is uninhabitable in wilderness. And if you go to when Moses is speaking in Deuteronomy, in Moses' song, I think it's Deuteronomy 30. Well, the Song of Moses, And when you get to verse 10 in chapter 32, he found a desolate land and a barren, howling wilderness. That wilderness there, that word is Wobohu. And so it is other places, and he's talking about, and so that is not describing creation. That's when we talk about the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. They wandered in the Wobohu. And so that idea of wilderness, really other than void or formless, is probably a better interpretation. And then tohu, again, chaos, some of the different words we use, really is kind of inhabitable. So the theory of the historical creationism is that I used to say it's kind of a modified gap theory. So so God creates in verse 1. Then the focus, beginning in verse 2, is on the promised land. Now, if you go to chapter 2, verse 10, there you see the rivers there. There's the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. So 3 of those 4 rivers are fairly easy to identify. Gihon is the land of Cush, which is Ethiopia, so that very easily could be the river of Egypt, which is also a description of, that's one of the rivers of the Promised Land. The Tigris and the Euphrates, description of the Promised Land. So the question is the 4th river there. So when he describes the Garden of Eden in chapter 2, verse 10, and gives those rivers, and then gives a very similar list with slightly different names given the time. You know how names change, right? It's the Sea of Tiberias, it's the Sea of Galilee, and there's one other name for the Sea of Galilee. I forget what it is off the top of my head. Yeah, Lake Chinnereth. So you've got like 3 different names for one body of water. So it's easily that these river names could have changed. And so his argument is that the earth, so the land, so that just if you in the word earth, again, land and earth, same word, audits. So the land was uninhabitable and wilderness. Covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God is hovering over. So there's like this fog depth water over top of this area that is the Promised Land. And so what we see beginning in verse 3 is God is preparing the Promised Land. Now, in the big picture of the Bible and the big picture of the Old Testament, the most important part of the world is what? The Promised Land. In the Hebrew Bible, it never calls it the Promised Land. It just calls it the land. And so when you see the land, most of the time when you see that, it means the Promised Land. And so that's really the biggest idea of historical creationism. So God's creator, out of nothing, ex nihilo. And then in theory, you could have had millions of years. And you had seasons, and you had animals live and die. He does not subscribe to the theory that no animal died until death came into the world, because we're talking about the blood of humans, not the blood of animals, for being lifeblood. And so this idea of the river, so that's what it is. So it's starting to form the land in the Promised Land. And so God's given special attention to this land that he is going to give the Israelites. And again, there's references like Jeremiah 27:5-6 is another reference of Ha'aretz, the idea of the land. Even in verse 10, God called the dry land, the word there, land, is the same word that's earth in verse 1. It's just translated differently in our English Bible, but it's the same word in the Hebrew. And so that's the biggest thing. So when you get to that, and some of the words that help to build that argument, that's why some of these key definitions come in. The first one is Reshit, and that is in the beginning. So the very first phrase of the Bible, in the beginning. The proper way to understand that, and again, we talked last week, most people think about God created the heavens and the earth, and it's like, and we don't, and I understand we don't call it the Big Bang Theory because that's associated with, and but our mind is God said God created the heavens and the earth. Boom, there's life, there's whatever, and so there's these bursts, and so it's all taken at once. In the beginning refers to, and it's always an extended yet indeterminate amount of time in not a specific moment. So the idea that I'm trying to say, creation was done in a specific moment, is not what the word in the beginning means. It means an extended period, normally an undetermined time, in the period of duration between a series of events. Also, this is the Pentateuch. That's the only time this word's used. So, for example, when they would measure a king, so I want to use our calendar, January to December. All right, well, let's just take it. So if we were saying, when did you become pastor of Dan River? I would say, somebody asked me this week, I'm 2.5 years. This is my third year. Well, if we counted according to Hebrew, I guess it was, anyway, if you would say, when did I start at Dan River? If we were counting officially when it would begin, you would count my pastorate as beginning January 1st of 2023. September to January is in the beginning. So when a king would take office, if they came in the month of Nisan, that's when Easter happens. All right. So if it's going to be in the month of Nisan, then from Nisan to the end of the Jewish year, that king's period of time, indeterminate amount, not a specific time, it's not a moment. That period is considered that's his in the beginning, and then we start counting years after that. So if we take that concept to creation, it would say in the beginning there's a period of time that God created the heavens and the earth. And I think Mike was telling me that he read Answers in Genesis, who was that's their deal, the 7-day creation. They are very anti-Genesis Unbound. Because Selhammer argues that we really don't know the period of time creation happened because it happened over an indeterminate amount of time, and all we know about it was that it was in the beginning. And then when we get to verse 2, because he's talking about the land, then we are talking about the promised land. And so the other part of that is, again, we talked about last week, bara is to make, and most of the words we see after this are bara, made, where ex nihilo is the out of nothing. And so you've got one word for create, and you've got one word for make, and asa, bara is create out of nothing, asa is to make. And so basically it's bara, asa, 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 asa. And then it says created, there's one other thing besides made, but that's create's only used a couple of times. God, by the way, as you look at that word God, is a plural word. The im on the end of it, that's the ending. The ending there is a plural ending. Now, as believers, so we believe in the triune God, so the idea that the word God, in the beginning God, right, so the Trinity created the heavens and the earth. They were all involved, so it's a plural word. And it does have a feminine ending, which will come more into play when we get to chapter 2. But just Elohim, it doesn't. We don't do it in English, but most foreign languages have masculine and feminine endings to match with the nouns, and so it varies on. So you can match up the noun and the verb easier in sentences. So Elohim is God; it's plural, and it also has a feminine ending. We talked about the sky and the land being a merism, so we've already talked about that. The earth, now the earth, it's improbable that he meant that it became the earth, the land became something. More likely, the way that word is written again is this idea that it was fixed, repaired, whatever, made not wilderness, but made into something useful. And so the big key to it is this idea of tohu and wobohu, and that they are, it means uninhabited in wilderness instead of formless and void. And so if you take that this land is a wilderness, then God's going to prepare this wilderness and then make it something special to prepare it for his people. And as he is preparing that promised land, it is what? It is good. And so he continues to point to the fact that that is good. And so the land that he's going to give them is good. And the idea of darkness, Hosic darkness, is never, the word darkness there in verse 2, darkness cover the surface of the watery depths. That is never used when the idea is something good. I use the word interesting a lot. And me and Madeline have this debate on occasion. She says I only use the word interesting when I want to say something is bad, and I don't want to tell the person that I'm talking to that they know I think their idea is bad. I'll just say that's interesting. Now, while that is a common use for me, I had a boss one time tell me, because I never realized I said it that often, to be honest. And I had the Pizza Inn, when I worked at the Pizza Inn, when I was in seminary, I worked at Pizza Inn for a year. And my boss looked at me one day and he goes, I want to tell you something. He goes, you use interesting all the time, and I'm going to start using it. He goes, because you're insulting people to their face and they ain't figured it out yet. And so anyway, if I tell you it's interesting, it does not mean bad. It might, but it doesn't have to be. But the idea is that the word is not used, the word darkness, Hosea, is never used to mean anything good. And so God's going to come back and you're going to say all creation is good. How can Hosea actually mean darkness in the sense that we think of it as being negative, right? Because John's gospel talks about darkness being bad. And so this word there probably is better translated something other than darkness. It's just kind of like, so instead of being darkness over the land, it's just kind of like a mist or a haze, a watery area over this land. And it could have been there a long time, and then God says, okay, now this, where this mist haze thing is hanging over the water, now I'm going to come back and I'm going to prepare this special place for my people. That's going to be the Garden of Eden, and eventually it is going to be the promised land for all the Israelites. And so that's basically the idea of historical. He wrote a whole book on it. And there's a whole chapter on Tohu Bohu. There's a whole book. Most of the things I'm trying to cover really briefly and try to keep it simple are chapters in his book. And but that's the biggest idea, is the main thing. So what I would want you to remember, if you're going to write down a note of historical creationism, is that God creates in the first verse, and the rest of the creation story is about preparing the promised land. So I know nobody's going to remember any of that stuff, and that's fine. But I wanted you to know that as you think about this idea that it's creation and then the preparation of the promised land, there is some Hebrew syntactical, grammatical reasons of why that is a viable. Now again, it has flaws, and there are plenty of people out there to shoot it down. In fact, the book got so controversial that it actually was taken off the shelves for a lot of years, and you couldn't get a copy of it. And then it went back into print, and you can get it now. But it's so it was taken off the shelves because it was considered so controversial. But it really, I mean, he goes through how it ties to Romans. He and I know it from class when he expands more than he does in the book. Because let me just tell you, our first month in class was this. It took us a month. When I took the class of Genesis under Dr. Selhammer, we spent probably our first 5 weeks on chapter 1 through 2-3. So there's a lot of stuff in there that's a lot more intricate that we don't have time to go into all of that. And but that's the idea of historical creationism. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, his statement would be, Daniel, we don't know because the Bible doesn't address it. But there could be animal death before the fall. There could be not animal death until the fall. But we don't know that. But that's where he kind of, and so it does. If you ever had absolute scientific proof, and the way they date is not proof; it's a concept. But if you had absolutely able to date something specific, carbon dating is flawed. And if it was accurate, and it was, so the world was created 2 million years ago. Even if that's true, it wouldn't matter. So God waited 2 million years before He prepared the promised land. And so there's never any chance that there is a conflict with science. And again, his motivation was not to come up with a way to argue with science. His was, what does the text say? I think I've shared with y'all before. My favorite criticism of it was in a footnote when I was researching something else, and it referred to Genesis Unbound. So clearly, I'm going to look and see whatever. And in most footnotes, unlike when we were write papers in high school, and we just write where it's from. In most academic writings, the footnotes can take up Dr. Selhammer's book, The Pentateuch, is narrative. There's this much writing at the top of the page, and the bottom, that much of the page is footnote that you have to read. And when we read the book, we were required to read all the footnotes. So a lot of academic writing is that way. So you read something up here, and then down here, it begins to talk about the book Genesis Unbound and addresses it for 3 or 4 lines. But the number one criticism, because it talked about it was a scary theory because it's tied so tightly to the text that people might fall prey to it. So if your biggest complaint against historical creationism is that it ties too closely to the text, I would take that criticism if I was Dr. Selhammer. So anyway, that's the deal with Genesis Unbound. That's in some of the key words that help bring you to that. Let's see. So again, grammatical conclusions, summary statement. God created everything, and then instead of being the description of the earth, it really is the forming of it. But that also does not allow, I just want to stress this, even this idea that even if there is an old earth, in no way does this theory say that evolution is there. I mean, in no way endorses. A lot of people think if you're trying to endorse all earth, you're trying to endorse evolution. It doesn't do that, because clearly, again, God bara man. God created man, unique creation. Which and I can't stress that enough, because when we get to the sons of God and daughters of men, I want you to remember that every human that has ever walked this earth descended from Adam, because God breathed life into them, or they are not human. Because every person, there's the Son of Man, there's the Son of that, there's the first Adam, which everybody comes to, there's the second Adam, which is Jesus Christ. So if an angel could conceive a child in a human, which is what some people want to argue that means that there would be human beings that were not conceived by Adam. And I don't think in big picture of the Bible that you can justify that. So we'll get to that more when we get to that passage. But I just want to kind of plant that ahead of time, because that is, there's a few things I'm pretty hard-headed about in Genesis, in the sons of God, daughters of women, daughters of men is one of them. One of my best friends, guys, supposed to play golf with Monday and Tuesday this week, and they have argued for hours about that. And Bill's still wrong. So anyway, can't fix it. Okay, next key thing I want to talk about, huge phrase, image of God. So let's go to verse 26. Then God said, let us, by the way, notice again, Elohim makes sense that it's a plural, right? It's a plural ending there, because when God's going to speak, it is let us, plural, make man in our, plural, image, according to our, plural, likeness. Our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, whole land, and the creatures that crawl on the land, on the whole earth. And but this whole idea, that right there, imago Dei, is actually the phrase. I forget if that's Hebrew, Latin, or Greek. But imago Dei, if you ever hear that expression, because there's a song called Imago Dei. There's a church, real good church in Raleigh called Imago Dei. Great church, great pastor, and he great pastor. And they go, Imago Dei is the name of their church. Basically, that's the phrase for image of God. So when we say we're created in the image of God, what does that mean? And so that's what I want us to kind of think about. And you can see here, so there's different images, there's different arguments about exactly what that means. But it has to refer to something that is similar, but not identical. Icon in the Greek language is image. It's a reflection of, but we are in the image of God, but we are not God. So it's got to be similar, but not identical. That word image can also be used of something that represents something else. So we're in the image of God because we represent God. And it goes on in the rest of that verse to explain how we're going to represent God, because we're the ones that are going to rule fish of the sea, birds of the sky, livestock. And that's why I believe Christians should be reasonable environmentalists. Our job is to protect the environment. Now, I say reasonable because we live in the United States and y'all all know what unreasonable means. But we should. So we need to be careful when we, because just to be frank, if you're trying to deal with somebody that's nuts on the environment, you never want to come across as you don't want to protect the environment. Make sure it's how you're protecting it. Because the deal is, we are biblically responsible to protect the environment. So when we can cut down smoke emissions, we need to do it. When we can do stuff that's reasonable, we need to do that. But we also understand this is God's world and He's in control of it. And man doesn't have near the impact on this world as we think we do. But, so He's put us over top of it. So again, that idea of image can represent something. Events that impact this idea of the image of God is the fall. So the image that we now have is distorted. The way we are now, right? Because we get, I saw somebody here today, might have been Randy, got a Band-Aid, got blood work done today, right? Yeah, right? So we had to get blood work done because our bodies are distorted because these bodies are going to go away and we get sick. And that just happens. I'll have mine in the morning, by the way. So don't think I'm just picking on you. But that's, but you know, the image is distorted because our glorified bodies are going to do what? Live forever. No blood work in heaven. Hallelujah, right? So it's distorted. There is, part of the reason we're in the image of Christ is we are redeemed in Christ. Progressive recovery to begin becoming more in the image of Christ. So we say become more Christ-like. That becomes more that we are becoming more in the image of God. And so this idea of being in the image of God is part of the redemption we have in Christ, that we become more like Christ, which means we become more like God, which is going to be our image will be restored and completed, perfected when? When Christ returns. So, and then at Christ returns, there's the complete restoration of God's image. One of my favorite verses in the Bible that we don't talk a lot about is in Romans 8. And it talks about, forget the verse reference, but it actually says that creation groans for the return of Christ. Because creation realizes it is not as beautiful now as God intended it to be. And I will say, by the way, just as a quick argument, going back to kind of what Daniel asked me about, could there be death for animals before the fall? The same thing, you know, so the question is, was there any death? So if you say there's no death, you can't have a beautiful fall without what? Death of the leaves, right? So you can't have the beauty of fall without the death of the leaves. So that's part of his argument. So nobody argues if there's a gap there that the seasons didn't still happen. And so the idea that there's death, well, animals are not in the image of God. So an animal dying does not necessarily have to be the result of the fall. And I'm convinced that there is any period of time there you had fall. Because I don't know about y'all, but that fall is just the prettiest. When the leaves are changing and you can get a good view of a mountain, it just sunrises / sunset at the oceans, and mountains with the leaves in the fall are I think they're the two most beautiful things. One quick stupid story, just because I think it's funny. So, we do sunrises on the East Coast, right? That's what. Now, if you grew up in California, if you want to go to the beach, what are you going to watch? You're going to watch the sunset. Guy got drafted by the New Jersey Nets and played for UCLA, grew up in California. Him and his wife loved to go out and watch the sunsets in California. So they moved to New Jersey, and they started practice in the summer or fall, whatever. So they decided they were going to go down on the boardwalk and watch the sunset. They were off by about 12 hours. So, because you can't watch the sunset on the eastern coast. But anyway, I always find that pretty funny. But yeah, so we do sunrise. West Coast does sunsets. All right. So now, aspects of God, image of God. One is moral. So one of the ways that we are in the image of God, and you can include these, exclude these. There's a debate on how these should be included. So I'm not trying to give conclusions. Personally, I think pretty much all of them. I think there's a lot of things with God we can't define all of it, and so all of these things point to the idea, and we can't really comprehend all of it. So I think all of these are good. I just wouldn't take. People want to argue that one is how it is as opposed to the other, and I think it's probably all of them. So moral. We are morally accountable to God. We are, right? We know God's invisible attributes because of creation. That's why we are held accountable. And so we are moral beings. We know the difference between right and wrong. I love, I've heard that a lot of philosophy people have used this, but it's somebody will say there is no absolute right or wrong, right? It's just relative to your upbringing. It's relative to your circumstances. There is no absolute right and wrong. And I remember Dr. Little was actually one of my philosophy professors, and he was over in Russia helping them develop the philosophy program for the Russian university system. Also fascinating, the guy from Southeastern was doing that. And he looked at the guy, and the guy from Russia, clearly being a little more on the liberal side of life, said, yeah, there's no absolute right or wrong. It's all relative to what you believe. And Dr. Little goes, okay, I'll go home and sleep with your wife. And the guy's like, well, no, you can't do that. And he's like, why? There's no right or wrong. And so people inherently know there's right or wrong. They just want to shape the right or wrong line instead of saying there's absolute truth. Yeah, no, we have. That's my next line. We have an inner sense of right or wrong, and it's our conscience. We have a conscience. Yeah, right now, I watch too many shows that involve serial killers, and so it fascinates me because serial killers, one or two things. One, they really are. They're in a flawed world. They basically don't have a conscience. That's some of the stereotype when you watch like some of the middle stuff on it. They just basically they don't know the difference between right and wrong. And they don't have that sense, or it's demonic possession, which I think is also a lot of. But we naturally have an inner, like I'm going to sleep with your wife. There's an inner sense of right or wrong. We know that. And our unlikeness to God is reflected when we sin. So part of our differences from God come when we sin. So there's the moral aspect of it. There's the spiritual. We not only have bodies, but we have spirits. Now you can be, I think I've gone over this before. So a dichotomist believes that our makeup is that we are body and soul. So John Campbell said here, this is the body. Thus there was, this is the body. And there's a soul. That's what I'm made of. What's going to live forever is the soul that's inside of me, and it's going to possess a different body at some point in time. Right? So that's a dichotomist view. Trichotomist view would argue that we are body, soul, and spirit. There's only one verse in the Bible that refers to it, that God will make you whole, your body, soul, and spirit. And so we can debate whether it's trichotomous and soul and spirit need to be used interchangeably or not. There's a ton of passages. We're not going to run all that down. But there is this sense, whether you call it soul and spirit or call it just soul, that we have this within us that can communicate with God. And so there's this spirit within us, right? My essence of who I am is not the body. It's what's inside of me. And that has a spirit that can communicate with God. The Holy Spirit enters me. And so the spiritual life allows us to relate to God. And again, immortality is not, we're not immortal because we don't sustain our own life. God sustains us forever. So I will live forever. I'm not immortal because I don't sustain my life for eternity. God does not change his mind, but if he decided to, he could, and I could cease to exist. But we live forever based on who, so we're not immortal, but our souls will live forever, either in heaven or in hell. So there's the spiritual aspect. There's the mental aspect. We have the ability to reason and think logically that sets us above the animal world. Now, I know that I know beavers build dams. I watched the thing on Twitter X last week that was fascinating, how these ants were trying to move something out, and they just like hundreds of ants moving this little stick thing, and they had to reshape it like 5 times, and it took them a bunch of different tries. And they did. So I know that the ability to reason. So it's not that there's not any ability to reason in animals, all right? But animals' ability to reason does not include the ability to conceive of eternity. And their ability to reason is not, and I'm not saying no human's ever been outsmarted by an animal, because I got dogs, and I've had dogs. So you can get outsmarted on occasion by an animal. But, I know it's never happened in your house, but on occasion, they can outsmart you. So, but the idea of mental, our logic and our build, there's a reason humans are the only ones that built a road. There are things that our reason is different from and that we can do, and our mind is different. And part of that mental aspect is because we have the ability to mentally grasp things more complicated than an animal. And that's how we use complex, abstract language. I don't know about y'all, but I love whenever a comedian just goes off on how bad the English language is. Like, is this word read or read? R-E-A-D, R-E-D, right? They're both read. One has an A, one doesn't. Well, if you put an A in it, shouldn't that be read? Well, it is read, but it's also read. And there's several comedians that just do bits of just flipping letters and stuff like that. If you ever find them on YouTube, they're hilarious. Because English in particular is just crazy. And so we have abstract kind of languages, and they're all different. We all have different languages. But we also have an awareness of the distant future. I understand squirrels store nuts for the winter, all right? But they're not thinking store nuts for 10 years into the future. You know, the animals can perceive some future, but our idea of long-term thinking is different. Creation, like art, music, technology. Animals, you know, an animal doesn't go out to make art, right? I mean, they might make something that looks pretty cool, but it's not designed to, you know, a beaver's not making something out of a log to impress his beaver friends and show off. He's doing it for functional purposes. So we have an awareness. We have creativity, art, music, technology. And our emotions are complex. Anybody disagree with that? If any man in this room did nod his head. Anyway, women, I bang on men a lot. The complex emotional thing, women, y'all might have their heads up on that. Or at least we never understand it. I'll put it that way. And the final thing is relational. The idea that we are relational. I mean, it's kind of like what I was talking about Davis, Larry. I mean, we are meant to be with people. We are not meant to be shut in. COVID. If there is ever any proof that we are not meant to be shut in and be alone and not get out amongst other people, man, it's COVID. How many people face depression? How many people had more mental issues? How many people struggled because they couldn't get out and interact with other people in the same way? We are relational as people. We have we've got marriage. We've got bonds within the church, just bonds with friends. We are relational beings. We are to be with other people. We are to be together. In fact, marriage, speaking of that, that's the image that God uses for what? Christ in the church. It is the idea of marriage. Christ is the groom and we are the bride. Okay, short little mini rant. Yeah. In American culture, look, I know I'm not going to change a thing, so that's fine. You can just tell me to shut up, and I will. I won't bring it up again unless you ask me a question about it. But we have completely butchered the idea of marriage in American culture, because whose day is the wedding day? Right? Is anybody going to argue with a woman about that? Because it's the bride's day, right? Can I just tell you that's completely anti-biblical? Because we are the bride of Christ, and we're not the important one at the wedding feast. The groom should be the focus, because the groom is the head of the family. Rant done. What's that? Oh, on the wedding? Oh, I would advise any guy getting married. It's the bride's day. I'm just saying, as American culture, it's backwards. Okay, rant over. And the final thing is, image of God, when we think about relational, we have the right to interchange and have the right to rule over creation. Rule over doesn't mean, that we slaughter animals to eat. How many people in here do have pets? Right? I mean, why do we like our pets, right? Because it's an interaction, right? They give comfort. Barbara's dog, Roscoe, she will tell you, knows more of her secrets than anybody's ever known. Her dog growing up. Because she talked to her dog. I remember, by the way, our first dog, Big Boomer, when he died, he got into some antifreeze and died. And I was telling some people at the rapid, I was telling Susie Halls, I'll never forget it. I told Susie, yeah, Boomer died yesterday over the weekend. He got in some antifreeze, and it's just not the worst way to go. Just still sad, and because he wasn't that old, he was only 3 years old. And I said something about it. She goes, well, tell your wife that I'm really sorry. She goes, I know you don't care, but I know your wife does. So animals are animals, but there is this bond that you can form with your animals. And so anyway, again, we're relational. So all those are. So any questions on the image of God? it really is one of the most important concepts of the Bible for us to have an idea and understanding of what it means. Because it feeds to the whole thing that we're going to do what? We're going to relate to God because we're in His image. I mean, it sets the foundation for why do we worship? We're in the image of God. We want to worship God. Everything is foundational in this fact that we are created in the image of God. Okay, Sabbath. Instituted by God during creation. Affirmed during the Ten Commandments. Right? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And an ordinance concerning manna, right? Because when you have manna, you couldn't collect it for one day, except for on the sixth day you collected double, so you wouldn't have to collect on the Sabbath. So God very much confirms this idea of manna, the Sabbath, particularly through the Pentateuch. So what does that do for us? How do we, now I'm going to say when I was growing up and I realized other than Daniel and Barbara and Carolyn, I'm the youngest person in the room probably. So when I say when I was growing up, I know y'all have even more stories like this than I do. You had blue laws and you had things you couldn't sell and stuff wasn't open. You couldn't find a restaurant because everybody was Chick-fil-A. You were closed on Sunday, and our culture has. And so look, I go out to eat almost every Sunday, so I'm not going to say or a lot of Sundays, but how should we observe the Sabbath? Because here's the other part I want to remind us. I'll say this before you answer, just to help you not be legalistic on it. Jesus said the Sabbath was created for man. Man wasn't created for the Sabbath. So you've always got this idea of you don't want to be legalistic on the Sabbath. So, where's the line? What does it mean? What's this idea of Sabbath that we need to make sure we pay attention to? Focus on God. What else? Anything else? Yep. Yep. Oh, got to be. Yeah. You can't let your cows go 2 days. Yep. Yep. That's right. No, and that's what I'm saying. So there's this idea. So the idea. So if I don't got to work on Sundays, if I don't want to do, I've got a job. I work every other Sunday. Or I work every Sunday. What do I do? What does it mean for me to acknowledge this? Because clearly, this is a big deal to God because He instituted it, puts it in the Ten Commandments. Right? That's the Big Ten. Right? He's going to narrow down everything, the 10, and then. When He's got the Israelites, they couldn't even, He was so serious about it, there's going to be maggots if you do it for 6 days, but on 5 days, and the 6th day, you're fine. And Hal's right. The biggest thing is, it is this idea. But the other thing is, our bodies are designed to rest. We are not designed to go full speed all the time. There are going to be periods, where you have to go every day. Jesus healed on the Sabbath. He went and He taught on the Sabbath. You get an ox out. There's things you have to do. So we don't be legalistic. But there is this idea that we need to corner away. I remember Tom Stock, who was our BJV regional representative. I love Tom. And he was talking last year when he came and talked to the pastors. In fact, he's coming in 2 weeks to talk to the pastors again. I love when Tom leads the sessions. He's great. And he was talking about burnout for pastors and what you have to do. And he gave examples of how he was way too. If you've met around Tom, you can see it. Just way too intense when he was younger. Worked 7 days a week, didn't take time off, and you have a lot of pastor stories like that. And so he was talking to us about. He goes, but what are you trying to do? It's not just take a day off. It's not just go on vacation for a day. It is a day to rekindle your body and to focus on God. And the question is, do we do that well? And I'll be honest, I'm one of the worst. I got a daughter that worries about it because she says she was studying the Sabbath a couple years ago and she told me a bunch of times that I need to take that more seriously. So I am in no way saying this as the expert as far as obeying this. But you really do have to have time to recharge. And the recharging isn't just mental and physical like society thinks of it. It's spiritual, right? You do need emotional. You need the mental. You do need physical rest. but you also need to relax, set aside time for the Sabbath. One of the great episodes ever, Andy Griffith. Any of y'all ever watched Andy Griffith? Do y'all remember when they were the pastor spoke on observing the Sabbath? And at Mayberry, pretty much in the afternoon, all you did was sit around and chew the fat, right? Back in the 50s and that kind of stuff. And so then all of a sudden they decided they were going to do what? Anybody remember the episode? They're going to have a concert, yep. Downtown. So all of a sudden now everybody worked the entire day because they were trying to put together a concert for that night. It was just pretty funny. And it's Andy Griffith, so it was just funny. Okay, I think. There you go. That was our pastor in Christiansburg. That was his turn. His turn. He said he always went home and had a holy horizontal on Sunday afternoon before he came back for church Sunday night. And that's what he said. Well, Pete's the first one I heard say it. But anyway, that's about it too. All right, we're going to stop there because the next thing is going to be the chart. Well, no, we'll hit blessing real quick. Have I got blessing on your thing? Yeah. So God blessed man in verse 128. This idea of blessing is God created the world. One of the blessings is he did give us authority to rule. And then at the very end in 2:3, God blessed the seventh day, declared it holy, for on it he rested. And so God blessed all creation and all the work of creation on the seventh day. So again, this idea that God, that's the other thing. When God says at the end of every day that this is, what do we say at the end of every day? It is good, right? So when God says, is it good? Is he going, you did a good job with that today, God. Right? I mean, do you think that's what he's saying? So probably not, right? I remember the first time I heard somebody use that illustration. I was like, yeah, that's probably not the right. But that's kind of how we think of it. We just kind of say, you look at it, it is good, and you want to think God just says, good job, God. But if we go back to, again, from the historical creation in perspective, there are a few things that I think it lines up really well with, and this is one of them. When God is, if you look at it, the idea that God is forming the promised land, where his promised land is for the people, everything that he did every day was, it is good. This land is good. This is the land I've made. It is good. This is the land. So everything that God does is good. Now you can say the same thing about creation, but I do think it lends towards the historical creation idea pretty good. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so all of this stuff is good for man. I'm preparing this for you. It is good. And when he talks about it is good for man, which goes into the idea of the blessing, that God created this world to be good for us. And that's why the fall is so bad, because the fall fractures a lot of that. Or fractures all of that. Well, not all. Fractures a lot of that. I'll get back to that. Okay, very good. Any questions? We'll pick up on the chart next week, because I think that's a pretty interesting chart. Okay.
We're talking about the spiritual part of the Sabbath. What happens if you don't finish? I give this example. For instance, if you skip church for I don't know what reason, doesn't it seem like the week off, coming week?
Depends who you are. Because there's some people so spiritually desensitized they don't think about it. I think as a Christian, if you're walking with God consistently and as a Christian, you just wake up on Sunday morning and say, yeah, I don't feel like going today. I think what you say is right, that it's going on.
But I just thought that may be one of the reasons for the Sabbath day.
And, like I said, it's one of them. So there's a lot of different things, but it really is something we need to to be honest about. I think we need to pray about that and consider that and think about that. It's something we need to be reflective on what that means. And even if I've got a job, is there a time? And I will tell you, Tom talked about one of the things he does is he's worked, and he says, I'm not even talking about a whole day a lot of times. He goes, I'm not even going to talk to you guys about taking a whole day. Because as a pastor, I've talked to several pastors, and one of the expressions I use is, our schedule is always in pencil. Other than Sunday morning and Wednesday night, my schedule's in pencil. Anything can change at any moment. And any pastor is that way. And he's like, you just got to block something you don't touch. And he goes, and he's got a period on Friday that he won't answer. He won't be in the same room with the cell phone. He won't be in any way where you can communicate him, and he just gets away. And we really need, that's the other thing I think we do lose a lot, is this idea of solitude. It's a great book, Donald Whitney, Spiritual Disciplines. And one of the spiritual disciplines he talks about is silence. And again, Western culture, Eastern culture, okay, I'm not on any, don't misquote me. Don't misquote me. I'm not in any way endorsing Eastern religions. That being said, the idea of meditation and reflection and silence, of trying to hear from God, not praying to give God your laundry list, but of actually just trying to listen and have God speak to you, is not something we're good at. Because we believe, right, we got to be doing something all the time. And when you believe you got to be doing something all the time, it's hard to just take a deep breath and rest in silence. Right? And people like me, silence is a hard thing because I talk a lot. But it really is one of those disciplines we need to practice. We need to set aside time to just be silent. And Whitney does a great job introducing and explaining the biblical reason, the biblical background for that and everything. Great book, by the way, if you ever look it up. It's Spiritual Disciplines by Donald Whitney. Absolutely. Well, here's the deal. We don't really, as Christians, honor the Sabbath in the way of worshiping. Because our Sunday is not the Sabbath. The Sabbath is Saturday. We worship to celebrate the resurrection every Sunday. And that's why we work Seventh-day Adventists. They do Saturday because they're very legalistic. And so they want to go back and work. And that's, worship on Saturday, I don't care. But, worship doesn't have to be on Sunday. But you need a consistent. In fact, they started a church. Church was dying. The larger church kind of took it over. What they did was stood the Army base at Fort Bragg, and they opened up their worship service was Thursday night. Their weekly worship service was Thursday night, and their goal was to get soldiers on Thursday night instead of getting them on Sunday morning. So it gave them one more time during the week they could go to worship services. And so, that's where, again, the idea of this, it's more, that's why I was trying to focus on the concept of the Sabbath more than the day of the Sabbath. This idea that we do set aside time to be alone with God. That's a good point. Yeah, so you could easily, what was it, Robinson Crusoe, where he was stranded, and I just remember this from a kid, and he said, God forgive me, he'd worshiped on the wrong day all these years because he thought it was Thursday instead of Friday. When he first got there, he'd been at sea longer than he thought, and he was a day off the whole time. And he worshiped every Sabbath. And when they find him and he gets rescued, he's like, God forgive me for not worshiping on the Sabbath. And, do you think God cared that he worshiped you on the wrong day? So, what's that? That's exactly right. So, all right, very good. Anything else? All right, let's pray. Dear God, we again come before you. We thank you that you created us in your image, that you created a world that is good, that you gave us blessings, that you gave us authority, that you give us the chance to relate to you, that you give us a mind that we can contemplate you and understand. We don't understand fully, but at least partially understand who you are. Just like relationally, we relate to you partially the best that we can, but one day it'll be made complete. We thank you for that. God, just ask that you will give us compassion, give us evangelistic hearts, give us service minds, and help us, Lord, to be the people that you created us to be, and help us to celebrate the world that you gave us as creator. It's in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.